And still it never arose to be anything more than a straight battered spouse case, which is very routine for immigration lawyers to handle. And only after October 10th, 2002 did it escalate into some sort of human rights disaster.
For Abdel Kewan, a self-employed house painter living in San Diego, Thursday, October 10, 2002 began like any other workday. After leaving his modest apartment located in the neighborhood of North Park, he drove his car north along Interstate 5 towards the city of Oceanside. As usual, Abdul was following a set of handwritten directions. They were scribbled on a piece of paper during a telephone interview with his new customer. When he reached the vicinity of Oceanside, however, he became confused by the exit signs. None of them seemed to correspond to the directions on the piece of paper, so he continued driving north, hoping to locate an exit that matched his instructions. Unfortunately, he soon passed the last turnoff for the city of Oceanside, and he had to remain on the freeway for another 15 minutes. When at last he found an exit ramp that did not lead to the beaches along the Pacific Ocean, Abdul decided to pull off the freeway and ask for directions. He soon found himself heading directly towards a gate that was covered in barbed wire and was guarded by a group of armed military police, or MPs. Abdel Kewan inadvertently had reached the San Onofre gate of Camp Pendleton, the largest Marine Corps base in Southern California. Like all U.S. military installations at the time, Camp Pendleton was operating at a heightened state of alert as a result of the terrorist attack of September 11, 2001. In spite of the potentially intimidating circumstances, Abdul's encounter with the guards at Camp Pendleton was friendly. He was asked to step out of his car. The MPs, following standard procedures for an incident of this type, conducted a thorough search of the vehicle. They also questioned Abdul, examined his written directions, checked his personal identification, and recorded the results of the vehicle search and the ID check in a standard report they're required to file. Finding nothing incriminating and that Abdel Kewan was not wanted by any government authorities, the MPs gave the house painter a clean bill of health and encouraged him to continue on his way. They even helped him by writing out a new set of directions so that he'd be able to find his way back to his painting project in Oceanside. He returned to the freeway and soon reached his destination. By the end of the day, the incident was forgotten. Abdul had no reason to believe that there would be any consequences as a result of his wrong turn off Interstate 5. Abdel Kewan was wrong. As an Egyptian-born Arab living in the United States, he was an easy target for a new type of discrimination. Exactly 2 weeks after his wrong turn on the morning of October 24th, officers from the Immigration and Naturalization Service, or INS, came to his apartment and arrested him. Since then, Abdul has been a prisoner at a correctional facility in Otay Mesa. Jonathan Montag, a San Diego attorney, provided background information about Mr. Kewan's case.
This is the case of a client of mine. His name is Abdul Kewan. We call him Abdul. That's the name he goes by. And he came to the United States at the end of 1996 as a crewman on a freighter ship. And he came here and he left the ship and decided to stay in the United States for a while. He made his way to Boston, Massachusetts, where he ended up getting married to a United States citizen, who then filed papers on his behalf. And as is the normal case, a person can fall out of status and then apply and not be arrested and be able to get papers through a spouse. And those papers were filed, but then he and his wife had problems, and she revoked her papers that she had filed on his behalf. So she That left him in a bad situation, and he ended up being placed in deportation proceedings with the immigration system. So that continued, and his wife then, and he moved, they didn't separate or divorce, they moved to San Diego, and then ultimately the relationship completely deteriorated, and he filed papers as a battered spouse because of abuse he was suffering from his wife. Those papers were approved by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and so he is eligible now to get a green card based on that marriage and its dysfunction. We had a trial on the merits of his getting his green card through his wife on December 10th, and the immigration judge said she would issue a decision shortly thereafter. The Immigration and Naturalization Service asked for the judge to delay her decision because they wanted to review the petition, the battered spouse petition, that they had already approved. They reported back in April that they had no problems with that petition and they were not going to revoke it. The immigration judge then indicated in an order that she was going to deny him permanent residence, and she would tell us why in a hearing on May 27th.
It seemed odd that the judge suddenly denied permanent residence to Mr. Kewan in spite of the fact that the INS had already approved Abdul's petition twice. Just as odd was her decision to put off an explanation for her actions, knowing that Abdul already had been in prison for 6 months and that her decision meant more time in jail for Abdul, despite the dubious nature of his arrest. Mr. Montag then described additional measures that he took on behalf of Abdul.
Meantime, there were some other forms of relief which he is eligible for, and we pursued those forms of relief at a hearing on May 27th. At that hearing, we also invited a FBI agent who had checked him out and gave him a clean bill of health, and he testified just to the fact that he interviewed him and he interviewed the wife and found there was no credible evidence that he was a bad guy. That's why they didn't arrest him ever. And the judge at the end of our hearing on the 27th, she reserved her decision for another 3 months. In other words, she didn't issue a decision on what she was going to do, and now we're waiting for her to issue it, and she said she would issue it by the end of August.
So again this time, despite FBI testimony about Abdul Kewan's good character, the judge delayed her explanation, knowing Abdul would spend another 3 months in jail. This would bring his total jail time to 10 months. 10 months for making a wrong turn and asking some guards for directions to work. Adding to the mystery, yet another immigration judge labeled Abdul as a national security risk.
Another immigration judge is responsible for the bond in the case, and we had asked for a bond and have consistently been denied a bond based on the belief from national security risk. The only adverse factor in the case is that he got lost traveling to Camp Pendleton and asked for directions. And that seems to be the sum total of the reasons why he's been held in detention for the past 7 months.
According to Mr. Montag, neither terrorism nor the Patriot Act can be the cause of Abdul Kewan's imprisonment, particularly since law enforcement officials already have given him a clean bill of health. His arrest was purely an immigration matter, but for some reason, officials kept invoking such terms as national security and risk. Why? And why did they refuse to explain their actions and ask for so many delays, knowing that Abdul was languishing in jail without a charge?
He's being held because he came to Camp Pendleton and asked for directions. And a report was made by the MPs that was forwarded then to some kind of joint terrorist task force. And 2 weeks later, a decision was made by the immigration officers or the immigration officials to take him into custody. There's no secret evidence in this case. There's no links to terrorism that motivated the immigration officials to arrest him. This is not a case where he's suspected of knowing people involved in 9/11 or having anything to do with it. So it's not related at all to those kind of heightened arrest authorities under the Patriot Act, but it's simply as a person who has visa applications pending with the government, and they've made a determination that he's a danger to the community. And at first it seemed like a very straight family immigration case for a person in immigration court. And like I said, 95% of the time or more, the people aren't detained and they're allowed to go to the immigration judge and get their papers. And this case seemed no different than any of those. When it became clear that the marriage wasn't an ideal marriage, then we discussed the ability for him to get papers based on the abuse he suffered, and we followed through with that. And still it never arose to be anything more than a straight battered spouse case, which is very routine for immigration lawyers to handle. And only after October 10th, 2002 did it escalate into some sort of human rights disaster.
Attorney Montag pointed out there is no reason for immigration officials to refuse to allow Abdul to post a bond, which would release Abdul from jail while he awaited for a decision.
So based on the fact that he was applying for his visa, they are able to take him into custody. But then if the immigration officials don't want to set a bond, a man like Mr. Kewan has access to an immigration judge for a hearing on a bond. And it was at that hearing that we presented the evidence that showed that he got lost. We presented evidence from the person whose house he went to paint with a letter explaining that he had given him directions and was waiting for him at that time. We even had the directions that Mr. Kewan wrote out, and we showed on the directions there was the ambiguity that caused him to get lost. We showed the MP report that showed the MP saying that he said he took a wrong turn, and that's why he was at the gates of Camp Pendleton. We had the letter from the person who referred Mr. Kewan to the person whose home he was going to paint, because Mr. Kewan had painted a few businesses downtown in San Diego, and one of those people referred him to the to the homeowner. Despite all, and we had the MP reports. We showed them to the immigration judge. Despite that, he made a determination that Mr. Kewan was a national security risk and held him in custody. The immigration attorneys said that Mr. Kewan was a national security risk because his coming to Camp Pendleton was not a normal act for a person to do unless they were a suspicious type person. The immigration judge found when he made his written decision denying a bond that he did not consider it to be likely that a person who is a painter would get lost driving their car. Later on, the Immigration and Naturalization Service also made an allegation that Middle Eastern men are a special group in that they are making false applications for battered spouse protection under the law. In his case, his petition as a battered spouse was reviewed a second time by immigration officials after this allegation was leveled, and they affirmed their initial grant. And in the general sense, never have I seen any document emanating from the Department of Homeland Security or any of the immigration officers who work for that department showing that there was any suspicion by DHS that Middle Eastern men are making false battered spouse petitions. There's no documentary or statistical evidence to support that. Yet those are the assertions that the immigration officials are making in court.
So Abdul waits. For those who have never been there, the Otay Mesa Correctional Facility is in a hot, desert-like location to the southeast of San Diego, near the Mexican border. Abdul has limited access to the outdoors, but there's no greenery there anyway. The Otay Mesa Correctional Facility is more harsh and sterile than most penal institutions in California. And just as bad as the location is Abdul's extreme isolation. Although theoretically he's allowed to speak to his attorney and see family members, Abdul has no family. Even the phone calls placed to his attorney must be arranged through the expensive telephones provided at the prison, an expensive option that he can no longer afford. He sits alone in his barren cell day after day, with no visitors and no legitimate explanation for his imprisonment. Since arriving in the United States, Abdel Kewan has worked hard to build a reputation as a dependable handyman and painter, someone who can be trusted.
Mr. Kewan is in his mid-30s. He came to the United States in 1996, so he's been here for 6 or 7 years. He's filed taxes every year he's worked here. His time in Boston he spent in construction trades and filed taxes every year because of his work there. And those tax returns have all been given to the immigration judge to motivate a showing of good character for him to get his permanent residence visa. Here in San Diego, he started work as a painter and had a tumultuous time at first because of the marriage and the divorce and all the problems with the immigration system. But he had established a business. He bought himself a car, he bought himself an apartment, and he was making money as a painter. And there's quite a few restaurants and cafes in downtown San Diego, as well as dress shops and other establishments that he painted, because he's a very accomplished handyman and painter.
Kewan earned his reputation by painting businesses and stores, including this upscale shopping center in Del Mar and businesses in San Diego's colorful Gaslamp district. We interviewed the owner of a coffee shop, which Kewan had recently refurbished.
I have a regular customer. They know Abdul, and they introduced Abdul to me as a painter and doing construction. And he came here, and really Abdul did a good job for me here, and he fixed the place because this is a historical building, and he did a good job with my paint job here, and he did a lot. He helped me here. I've been a long time here in this location, more than 13 years, and we have a lot of work here, and he had a lot of talent, and he was very responsible, and he used to come at the same time, and he stay late. I close the store and I leave him. I trust him. I leave him inside the store and the key with him. And next day I come, I found everything ready here, and everything done. Then I introduced Abdul to more friends and business people in downtown and Del Mar and North County. And really it was great. He went to Del Mar and he built from zero a very beautiful boutique in Del Mar Plaza. We have news from his family in Egypt. He had a mother, old lady. She's worried and she's crying every day, and his father, same thing. We asked the government help Abdul and ask them to be merciful. I ask everybody to help Abdul and release him soon, and we want to keep him in this country. This is a great country and the most beautiful land, and this is the dream. And why Abdul came to the country? For this reason. I don't think Abdul is a bad person, and he want to live like any American man in this country. It's not only Middle East people or Middle East community. All the neighbor or the American, they were worried and asking a question, and everybody nervous and why, what happened. and because he was a nice man, and we didn't see anything wrong from him, and everybody tried to help. The Middle East people, they were worried a little bit because it's not only this happened with Abdul, happened with other more people, especially after September 11. Why maybe confusing, maybe people or some people, or maybe insecure. We can't understand, but this is make all the atmosphere is not comfortable. The people not comfortable. What happened with Abdul, and we hear there's more people in jail. They have the same case, and they hold them for no reason.
According to Hasim Ibish, a regular contributor to the Los Angeles Times and communications director for the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, the case of Abdel Kewan has been mirrored throughout the country.
However, there are some egregious cases of people being detained in a completely unnecessary way. For instance, in the immediate aftermath of September 11th, there was a prominent doctor of Saudi origin in South Texas who was extremely well known in his community. His name was vaguely similar to one of the hijackers. He was picked up. His identity could have been, confirmed with a simple phone call. He's a very well-known person, and yet he languished for 2.5 weeks in jail without process, without being charged, without access to an attorney, just because somebody confused his name with somebody else's. Certainly, we've seen a case of a Pakistani man whose papers were completely in order, but who's been detained indefinitely for many months now, and who's slated for deportation, not because he did anything wrong with his immigration status, but just because he helped two friends find an apartment, and it turned out that they were out of status, and because of that he's being deported. Cases like this don't make anybody any safer. Certainly, we've seen, very lengthy detentions over 3/4 of a year in one case, of someone being held without charge and without an attorney, and just languishing in jail, in a kind of extra-legal, extra-constitutional way. And I think also the fact that there are American citizens who've been labeled enemy combatants and who are being held in military prisons without any access to due process, again, really does fly in the face of our basic understanding in this country of who goes to jail and why, and when people are accused by the government of wrongdoing, what kind of rights they have.
Jonathan Montag summarized the facts surrounding Abdel Kewan.
In the case of a Middle Eastern man who approaches the gates of a military base, we would understand that the national security apparatus of our country would be concerned about them and should take a look and see what's going on. But once they make the determination that there's nothing wrong, once the FBI checks out the person and says they're clean, once the naval security officers at the base make a determination that nothing's wrong, and they look at the MP reports and the car search and the home search and everything, and they see there's nothing wrong, we have to have some faith that these gentlemen, men and women who do this work can come to conclusions that are reasonable. It disheartens me, having done this kind of work for more than a decade, and assuming that what matters in court is evidence and not fears and prejudice and innuendo and supposition, that suddenly there's a case where there is no evidence. And I think it's clear that there's nothing that ties Mr. Kewan to any bad acts, and yet he's being detained like this. So it's deeply troubling to me that the system that I work in and have faith in seems to be making decisions that are contrary to the elements that one would suspect or would expect that a court system would use in making a decision about detention and the issuance of a visa. I think that the remedy in this case is going to have to be political, because there's no legal impediments to him getting his papers. So I would ask that anybody who's concerned to contact their political leaders, their congressmen, their senators, their newspapers, and human rights organizations and demand that somehow this be explained and demand that justice be done for Mr. Kewan. The Immigration Service has the authority to release him at its will, and he could be released on the street tonight if people became indignant about this treatment, and the government of this country wouldn't suffer as a result, because it's virtually without any doubt, it's doubtless that Mr. Kewan is not a danger to this community or this country, and if he were released on the street, we'd all be better off for it.
Kewan wanted to be nothing more than a part of working America, earning an honest living. He made an honest mistake, and now he's being punished.
One thing that I think needs to be said about Mr. Kewan is that Mr. Kewan did nothing wrong. He did nothing to threaten America. He's paid his taxes. He's been a friend to the community. The local merchants here in downtown San Diego all have nice things to say for him. In other regimes and other times, people have been placed in detention for long periods. I mean, Nelson Mandela was placed in detention for a long time in South Africa. But everyone would have to admit that Nelson Mandela's intentions in South Africa were to overthrow the system. And even though the apartheid system was an evil system, they certainly were justified in wanting to keep him off the streets because he was an enemy of their system. But Mr. Kewan is not an enemy to the United States system or way of life. He loves this country. He loves what we do here. He wants to be part of it. And he's being detained not because of anything he thinks or anything he did, but because of a terrible misunderstanding while driving. And that this gets perpetuated for such a long time is a terrible tragedy for him, and it's a terrible event for the whole country.